Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to PyBay 2019. It gives me great pleasure to welcome the Python Steering Council here for this session, who are going to be having a panel discussion led by Paul Everitt. A lot of household names, great developers of the Python community on this panel who inspire us daily. So it's really gives me great pleasure introducing Paul, Łukasz, Benjamin, Emily, and the one and only Barry Warsaw. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming to the entertaining, if not informative, panel discussion on how Python works. Please ask questions. I'm going to go ahead and start with that. Don't make me use my questions. They're not as good as your questions. Think of some great, piercing, penetrating questions. It's our job to entertain you. It's your job to entertain us. So please, make sure you come up with some good questions. Here's the format. We will start with a brief introduction by everybody. Then we'll come back and we'll go through each one. We'll give kind of a position statement about some topic on the governance of Python that is important to them. And at that point, all of you will have come up with your great questions. And did we decide if we're going to have them come to the aisle or you're going to go around? All right, cool. All right, so introductions.
Hi, I'm Łukasz. I contribute to Python for 10 years now, but everybody knows me for a little project I wrote last year called Black. I'm the release manager of Python 3.8, which sounds like a leadership position, but really I'm not even the queen. I'm the Prince Charles of the project. So that's it.
My name is Benjamin Peterson. I've been a core developer of CPython for 11 years now. And I'm the release manager of 2.7, which is also like Prince Charles because he lives a really long time and it's painful and embarrassing. But to help you stop using 2.7, I wrote this little library called 6. So I hope that's helped one or two of you stop using 2.7 so I can retire. You have one.
Hi, I'm Emily Morehouse. I am the Director of Engineering at a company called Cuddlesoft. I'm also the PyCon chair for 2020-2021. I have been a core developer since September 2018, and I implemented the infamous walrus operator.
My name is Barry Warsaw. I have been doing Python core development since 1994. Brett Cannon just recently is cleaning up the database of core developers, and one interesting tidbit that he told me about, which I didn't really know at the time, is that I'm the first non-Dutch contributor to Python. So it makes me feel really proud that I'm sort of also the bass player of Python, you know, sitting there in the back and not doing much.
All right. Again, our only purpose here is to make you laugh, but if you accidentally learn something, that will be good as well. So let's have each of you, if you would, get us oriented on this topic of Python and the governance of Python, governance in general. What is a topic that is really important to you?
Well, Python has been governed for the longest time by mostly by its creator, the benevolent dictator for life, Guido van Rossum. That situation changed. Last year we were given a very important and tricky task by him of like, you figure out how we're going to govern ourselves now. I think we did a pretty good job actually producing quite a bunch of PEPs and agreeing to how we're going to agree in the future. So now there's a group of 5 people, which I'm not on. I'm just the Prince Charles, right? Who are actually deciding on where the language should go. They have absolute power. That is in the PEP advised that they not abuse. So far, they've been doing a good job. In fact, I would expect them to actually be more kind of prescriptive, like have some roadmap to like where they feel Python should go, so that there's some clear focus there. You know, a governance part that I really deeply care about is that Python stays relevant in the changing world of the devices we're using and the ways we are like kind of interacting with computing. This morning's keynote was kind of illuminating of like how, you know, conversational interfacing with computers is going to be increasingly important. So having Python available as a language that can be used for all of those things, like, is kind of exciting for me.
Let me, to follow up on that, you talked about the place that we've arrived at after this long period of time, and now there's a new model. Could you give, briefly, your comments and looking afterwards at the fact on kind of meta governance, the process by which Python got to that model of governance, that like 9 months to a year, go figure it out for yourself.
Yeah, like Guido doesn't give easy tasks for the core devs. So his task was, not only do you have to agree how you're going to govern the project from now on, but you have to agree how you're going to govern the project. So first we were faced with a meta problem of how we're going to even decide on what is a possible model. So in the end, like, there was a vote that was open to all active core developers, like the definition of somebody active and who a core developer actually is, and where's a kind of normative list of such people was a big part of that. But long story short, we actually did have a vote. There was, if I remember correctly, 7 PEPs from 8010 to 8016 with kind of not really competing, but I really want to think like complementary ways to govern the software from now on. I authored one. It was the first one to lose, meaning it was like the second most popular choice. But I think it kind of at least like it taught me a lot about like how we interact as people, because it's a project actually governed by humans. So I'm like pretty confident like with the situation we ended up with, which is steering council chosen for each release of Python, consisting of 5 people, for which also there are elections.
Audience participation time. Raise your hand if you were paying attention during that whole kerfuffle. All right? For those of you who raise your hand if you're pretty non-pissed off okay with the result. All right, cool. Benjamin.
The other meta problem we had to discuss a lot was voting methods. Programmers love talking about voting methods because right, it's a perfect problem because you can prove there is no perfect voting method, right? So that means you can come up with hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of voting methods and argue about which one is slightly better than the other. So we did that for a while. One thing I think is very important for Python governance and governance generally is figuring out how to manage really large-scale discussions, right? So sort of partially as a consequence of its popularity, if you offer any sort of possible change or opinion on Python, you can get thousands and thousands of opinions and thousands of people willing to offer their opinion. And it's very hard to manage those kinds of discussions when you have mailing list threads, any kind of communication where there's more content than any one person can consume. It's very hard to figure out how to actually come to some consensus with all those different opinions being expressed, and I don't think we know how to manage those kinds of discussions well yet.
Okay, so I think that when Guido first stepped down, there were a lot of these feelings of uncertainty and hesitancy and like not really knowing what the next steps were going to be. And I think it happened in a way that was kind of like ripping off the Band-Aid. It was something that inevitably was going to have to happen at some point in the future. And so I think that looking back, it's really interesting to think about how people respond to and adapt to change, and how now looking back, like now that we've gotten here, I think as a whole, are very happy with the result. And we have a system that is really made to serve Python in a long-term sustainable way. And to make sure that we're doing things like, we have a sort of built-in changing of the guard where as Python is evolving, its leadership will evolve as well. And that is ultimately going to lead to a more dynamic and stable language for the course of time.
As follow-up to that, the outcome that was arrived at, from your perspective, was it foreordained, or do you think things could have gone a different way?
I think that things could have completely gone a different way. I think that as a whole, though, that it was really a good way to learn how everybody worked together and reach a point of like truly wanting a democracy and not wanting to just take the easy route of just replacing Guido with somebody else.
Mm-hmm. All right, Emily said changing in the guard, so hand your microphone to Barry, because I think that was a reference to the fluffle.
Well, I mean, despite the fact that Paul and I have retained our youthful charm, I think there's two things about the change in governance that I really like how we ended up. And I think back on sort of the early days when I was coming up with this PEP idea, right? I took that model from like RFCs because we were at CNRI and they ran the IETF and we were pretty familiar with the RFC process. But it seemed way too heavyweight, right? Like it seemed like so much process and documentation and things like that. And the idea behind the PEPs, and I don't know if it's succeeded now, however many years we've had it, was just enough bureaucracy to get things done, right? And no more. And I kind of feel like the governance model that we came up with is within that spirit. So it's just enough to sort of unblock the decisions that we had to make. But not so much bureaucracy that it's unmanageable and that it's top heavy. So I think that's one really great advantage. Like the first few months that the steering council met, we had to sort of figure out certain things, and we had to unblock all these decisions that were backed up because we had no decision-making process. So I think that's really good. And the other thing I think is something that you touched on, which is that one of our goals is so that the steering council doesn't have to make decisions, right? So delegate as much as possible. And that democratizes the evolution of Python. And as you said, it future-proofs us because, as some of us start to wind down in our, involvement in Python over the next few years, it allows new leaders to come up through the ranks, through whatever process that is, contributing to Python, becoming core developers, getting involved in the decisions, becoming BDFL delegates, and then working, into leadership positions. And I think that's really critical. I mean, if Python's going to be relevant for the next 25 years, it's got to be new people coming into the community that help shape what it means to be Python. So
people in this room are going to be up here instead of down there.
Yep.
Is that everyone? All right,
Hopefully.
All right, start thinking of your questions. To follow up on a thread for several of those, history is written by the winners. The PEP process, as I mistakenly remember things, I remember things to serve the story I'm currently telling. As I remember it, was controversial, similar to the election argument thing, that at the time, everybody had some stupid-ass opinion about how it should be done, but then it was done, and now we all look back on it as the obvious official. It's always been that way kind of thing. For some of you having some questions, if you've got examples from other projects that did something good on governance, bad on governance, war stories about successful projects that foundered because they couldn't kind of cross the chasm as they grew up, please share those as well. First question, Luciana.
All right, good morning, thank you. I'm really glad you guys are all there representing the steering council. So my question is, there is a growth in demand for end-user programming, right? This is becoming more and more of a thing. People are being, actually, corporations are hiring people for administrative jobs, but asking for knowledge of programming so that they can automate stuff. And I think Python is really good at that, but I am afraid more recently some decisions have been made in the core language that make it difficult for end-user programming. So it's like, for instance, typing is something that it's a good thing for large corporations that employ software engineers, but for end users, okay, I understand that they can ignore it, but we can't really. It pops up in places. So I want to ask you about if you think how much the steering council thinks about end users, those kinds of users of the language, and what you're doing to try and listen to them. Thanks.
Moderator's privilege. I'm going to have two people answer this. Emily wears two hats. She also wears a hat as the Grand Poobah of PyCon this year. Round of applause. Talking about a job nobody wants. Did I say that out loud? No. Good job for volunteering for that. Talk a little bit about that from both perspectives, and then I want Łukasz to answer. He gave a wonderful keynote at PyLandinium. There was a point in there that you talked about, I believe it was Alan Kay and symbols and expanding the amount you can fit in your brain at once, and the tricky divide between scaring off beginners versus empowering.
Emily?
So I think that is a really interesting question. I think that it is a line that we frequently have to walk. I think that if we were to get to the point where we were making decisions for only our advanced users, we would be losing out on such a large base of people who wanted to learn Python and love Python the same way that we do. But I also think that in certain ways, we have to keep moving things forward. And we have, we could have stopped a while ago, and Python would have been an excellent language for people to pick up and automate tasks and run scripting and all that stuff. But for Python to remain relevant, we have to kind of take those risks and very carefully and intelligently kind of look at that and say, this is enough of a risk and is going to be worthwhile enough to keep Python relevant to make that choice.
All right. Who here wrote Python in the last week? Some Python code. Who here used a decorator in the last week? Who here wrote a new decorator in the last week? See, my point here is that Python is a very big language. Just look at the grammar. You can just go through the grammar for tens or hundreds of minutes because it's actually very big. However, you don't actually end up using every nitty-gritty detail of it all the time, let alone actually implementing parts of it that are pretty powerful. You are using descriptors every time you're using Python, but you don't have to think about using descriptors every time that you're using Python. So I wouldn't necessarily say that every feature that we add to the language makes it harder for it to be used. Typing is obviously kind of a visible feature, right? It's there, there's annotations, there's kind of recommendations of certain members of our core team, to actually type check. Others would say that it's kind of not really what Python is about, but I do agree with the keynote speaker this morning who said that, hey, typing, it's like documentation, only more serious. So I would actually argue that probably that can largely help newcomers rather than make their lives more tricky. The point of it is that it should just be as ergonomic as possible. All right. Okay, so as you enable your computer again, yeah, okay.
I actually have a small follow-up. I think that one of the interesting kind of perspectives on this too is when you think about it within a company and somebody who comes in and is doing a job, you can kind of set guardrails and specific boundaries for what that code is going to look like. I think it becomes even more interesting when we think about how these new features that are added to Python are going to affect open source and how approachable our different libraries are for newcomers to come in and jump into.
All right, all right, good.
What lessons have you all learned about how the steering council communicates and works that you feel could be applicable to like engineering organizations in general?
Very good question. All right, we'll have both of you take this. Here you go, Ben.
One thing is we're not actually the steering council. The introduction was wrong. Only Barry here is on the steering council. We're just some randos. Steering council communication. Yeah. So every once in a while, a piece of paper flutters down from the sky in Aramaic, and we. Yeah. I think. One of the things that's been very good about the steering council is that they, as Barry said, they went through the backlog of stuff. And so a lot of things which was just kind of sitting around for like decades, like PEPs which have been pending for decades, were kind of dealt with. And every month when they have a meeting, they produce notes and so forth. So I think sort of the transparency has been improved a lot in the Python governance process. And also there's because they have this task assigned to them of governance, things make forward progress, and we can see that in their notes. And of course, the notes are publicly accessible. It's not just anyone can follow along.
Yeah. So just to like provide a little more transparency on how we actually operate, we basically have a 1-hour Skype conversation every week. We have an agenda, and we do have a private repo, so that kind of holds our agenda for the next meeting. And we've had to kind of figure out how to do it because, right, like there's nothing said in the PEP that says this is how you will make your decisions. I actually think that we have a pretty functional steering council right now. So. We're all very respectful of each other, and we have diverse backgrounds, so that's really helpful to get different points of view. And we do disagree sometimes, but we always end up, I think, on the right decision, as a group. And I think that's really important to sort of speak as one voice. And we all, we resolve those differences in a very constructive way. So I think it's very functional. And now that we've sort of and the other thing that we've done is we have somebody, taking notes during the conversation, and then that's what we try to publish. We try to publish those meeting minutes so that everybody can really see what goes on. So there's actually kind of boring at times, like sometimes we have a meeting and there's not really much to talk about. But now that we've gotten through the backlog, we're starting to think about longer term decisions, right? So like, one of the things about Python is the language has always changed from the bottom up, grassroots. Somebody has a cool idea, and they work it out, and they figure it out, and they write a PEP, and that PEP goes through the process. And I think you can look at any language feature from, the walrus operator to, whatever. It's always kind of percolated up from the bottom up. And what I think is interesting now is that we sort of are trying to see global issues and figure out how to address those in a beneficial way for Python.
And meeting notes are in Aramaic.
Yes.
Okay, got it. I'd like to go a little further into your question, and maybe Emily and Łukasz, you can give your opinions on it. In being an effective steering council or leader of a large distributed organization that isn't just Python, as you mentioned, there are others that could learn from this. Sometimes you get this weird dichotomy of a choice between, am I going to be effective or am I going to be legitimate to the will of the governed? Where I go through all this extra work and ceremony to do things in a transparent way, blah, blah, and then I make the decision I was going to make anyway.
Actually, I'm very happy that we have a steering council now that is so diverse, because it's hard for kind of grassroots members to have a holistic view of like what Python really is now. There's entire industries where Python is a crucial tool for them now. It's hard to kind of grasp the entire, like the enormity of what the language is, and features that are very important in one place, like for a part of the community, might be absolutely inconsequential for somebody else. Async I/O was transformative for a lot of people, whereas there's going to be a large number of Python programmers who will never use it, and that's all right. So actually having a steering council be that body that can look down and have representatives of kind of different views makes it easier for them to like see those diverse issues. Before we just had Guido, and he had this entire responsibility on his own, which I think like is like almost impossible to do, and yet he did for multiple decades. So that's amazing. I'm pretty happy that now he has like people that help him with it, or otherwise like he is a helping member of the entire council.
I think that we should be very grateful that we have a steering council who all of them seem to embody this desire to be very well informed and not really fall into their own like personal myopic views, and really making choices for the greater good, and also making sure that they are staying effective, and not necessarily like putting up blockades to allow people to continue moving forward. And so just really being that like enabling body. And from what we've seen so far, I think with how quickly we were able to get a bunch of PEPs rolled out and all that stuff, I think that has had a very good balance between the process and the transparency, but also remaining effective.
Both of you kind of commented about avoiding blind spots by bringing in more voices and more people working on it. All right, question.
Hi, Nick Acosta, IBM. Thanks for speaking with us. I had a performance question, if that's okay. So TensorFlow recently just switched from, by default, they would translate your code. If you were writing in Python, they would translate it to C and then run. They just switched it to their default is if you write it in Python, it's running in Python. And you're not seeing, like, it doesn't really get any slower. And I'm seeing that in other, especially if you're doing data-centric things. It used to be very common to translate it into C and then run your Python code as C, and now it's becoming a lot faster to just keep it in Python. So I was wondering if I have some assumptions, but like, what is the reason for that like performance increase?
Who wants this one? I don't know who to steer it to.
I guess. You want to?
Whatever. All right. Well, I think partially this is because people have built very good primitives for numeric computing, usually not in Python. So things like NumPy, and especially TensorFlow, like their whole scheme is they sort of like turn your Python operations into low graphs, which then the TensorFlow framework goes and evaluates not in Python. So depending on your view, it's either a very clever idea or like very elaborate workarounds for Python's performance weaknesses. So it's very good that most people can be writing more things in Python, but I don't think we become dramatically better at multiplying matrices in Python. But it's good that the language is extensible enough to allow you to reach into to access some of the more advantages of C and C++ and native code and GPUs and so on and so forth.
Okay, so I have 3 questions. I'm just going to start out, first of all, with a statement. I want to say thank you. I've been writing Python code since I was about 13 or 14 years old. I'm now 24, and I'm currently making a living off of it. So I'm just going to get a bowl. That's how I make my living. The first question was for Barry and related to the fact that I'm 24 and I want to contribute to core Python. So like, what are your plans for doing that and how should I actually do it? I had a question for Emily, which is where do you see the future of the language going if it's not going to necessarily support advanced users? And then I got to look at the third question. I have it in here somewhere. Didn't save the note. Anyways, those 2 questions.
That first question sounds like a question that you paid him to ask, because we talked about this.
Well, so like Emily and I were just talking about this before the session started. It is a little difficult to find the issues on bugs.python.org that are consumable by new people coming into the community. Like, a lot of them either have just years and years and years of discussions and no decisions, or they may already have patches on there that may not have been turned into PRs. Python there's a lot of stuff, right? There's lots of libraries. I just helped a colleague of mine, mentored him to become a core developer, and the thing that worked for him was finding a package, the email package in particular, that wasn't seeing much love. And I think that's one way to do it. I think the other thing is don't get locked into thinking, oh my gosh, I have to know C, or I have to fix bugs in Python to become a core developer, right? Like, there's tons and tons of stuff that you can do to contribute to Python. And that's one of the things.
You can program and restructure text, right? Yeah. Sit there and type docs.
Well, I mean, it's one of the things, like when I was getting my colleague core developer, I kind of bristled a little bit because there were people who said, well, I want to see a portfolio of 20 PRs. But I think that that's really kind of missing the point. There's so many ways to contribute to Python that we should honor and celebrate any of those ways that people want to come into the community.
And if you want to hear a little bit more about that too, shameless plug, I'm giving a talk on my journey to becoming a core developer, which actually talks about this a lot tomorrow. And so your second question was about the kind of future of Python, where is Python going? And I think that in order to ask where Python is going, I think that we have to kind of zoom out a little bit and see where technology as a whole is going and how those things are going to shape our lives differently. And so whether that is autonomous vehicles or being able to run Python on mobile devices, whatever that is, I think that we have to be looking forward to the things that we're going to want to build, and then how does Python play a role in that story?
Hello, my name is David Lord. I'm one of the maintainers of Flask, and so I use one of the PEPs, the currently active PEPs a lot, the WSGI PEP. 3333. And I'm also kind of involved on the periphery of the ASGI spec, which is not a PEP yet, even though it's at version 3 plus by this point. And my question was kind of about the PEP process and what should be a PEP at this point? Who should be writing PEPs? What should they be about? Should they be about language features that require syntax changes? Should they be about a web spec like WSGI or ASGI? And when should we be submitting those? Should we wait 3 versions to see that it's proven technology first, or should we be getting it in early before anybody's actually used the feature? What are your thoughts?
How many times have you read that whiskey PEP?
A lot.
I'm going to give this, Benjamin, to you, and I want you to give a companion answer about how does stuff get into a release, and the role of a release manager for that.
All right. Well, that's a big topic. So I think historically PEPs have encompassed quite a lot of different things. So we can start with the obvious. So if you're making a syntax change to Python, it obviously needs a PEP, right? But also there have been various specs. So Whiskey, also the database adapter API is in there, and I think Python is probably a big enough community that those don't need to be official CPython PEPs anymore, right? So I think especially the web community, so people who write web servers, web frameworks know a whole lot more about how the Whiskey protocol, asynchronous Whiskey protocol should work than most people who are core developers of CPython know. So the skills needed to evaluate whether a syntax addition is a good idea are different than those needed to know whether a new version of Whiskey is needed. So for those kinds of things which are sort of almost just only using the Python language, I would encourage you to move those to a separate organization or something. Get people who are interested in that. It doesn't have to happen under the umbrella of Python PEPs.
If you want.
Okay, I maybe but I guess, but like, who is the steering council going to stamp the whiskey pep?
No, definitely not. I mean, like we would probably delegate it, but I think it can be helpful to have those kinds of informational PEPs in the system so that they're just convenient to point to and say, we support this standard. I'm not saying it has to be, but it can be. I don't know. I mean, it's
okay. If you want to rule on web frameworks, then
no,
be
I
my guest.
definitely don't. I don't know anything about them. But like that's why most PEPs will get delegated for decision making. Like the steering council won't do it.
We'll go on to the next one.
All right.
Hi, I just have a question. I assume you guys looked at other programming languages when reassigning the governance of Python. I just wanted to ask, of the top 10 languages in use, which was governed the worst?
Love it. Who has an opinion on it? You have a big, of course.
Well, I'm not going to give a satisfying answer here, but let me just tell you that we did a rather elaborate kind of survey of how different languages are governed, how different communities approach governance of large-scale like software projects that kind of included programming languages, but not only. Surprisingly, there is quite a lot of them that are now clearly corporate-driven, which sometimes involves, a bunch of corporations kind of arguing for days. But most often, like the newest languages are mostly just governed by a single corporation, where maybe there are outsiders, but they're mostly looking in, and the most important decision processes are kind of kept away from the general community. Such governance systems were kind of out of reach for us, even if we wanted them, or we don't really. Like the point being, like Python is the biggest community-driven programming language on the planet. There's nothing quite like it, where there is no steering corporation. There is not even like a group of corporations that have some kind of working group and they decide where Python is going. There is a bunch of volunteers that spend their own time that actually shape the language for all of its users. So the governance systems that we mostly disagree with were the one where they just didn't fit that process. They didn't fit the nature of the language.
There's something you brought up that was the list of questions, one of the questions I had. And I'm going to use it to ask Barry a question and then use it to follow up on a point that you were making. Hey, Barry.
Yes, Paul.
Does the PSF control Python? Does PSF make the decisions for the language?
No.
What?
I kind of like the way, I mean, it's all been organic, right? And Paul and I go way back on like the community governance side, but I really like the way it's sort of falling out where the PSF does what's right for the community and the steering council hopefully does what's right for the language. And they're two different things. But one of the things that we've done is like Eva, who is what I don't remember her title. It's the executive director, I think, of the PSF. So she is now sitting in on the steering council meetings, not in a decision-making process. But what I really like about that is that there's a lot of overlap between the responsibilities of the PSF and the responsibilities of the steering council. And so actually having a council where we can have that kind of partnership so that where that overlap happens, we can do what's right for the huge universe of whatever Python is. I think that's going to really improve both the community and the relationship of the community with the language moving forward.
Kind of a separation of church and state a
Yeah,
little bit.
yeah.
I brought that up because of what you said. And before there was a PSF, there was a thing called the PSA, Python Software Activity. And it emerged at a time when the Python Labs team, which was you, Jeremy, Ken, Guido,
And Fred.
and Fred.
And Tim, actually.
No, he wasn't at CNRI.
He wasn't at CNRI, but he joined.
Were employed by someone who, an organization, I will assert, wanted to milk the cow. Do you want to challenge my assertion on that?
No comment.
That's what I thought. Come to the PyCharm booth afterwards and hear all the stories I can't tell with a video being recorded. And I'm serious. They're good stories, and some of them are true. But there was a moment where this wasn't the path that we were on, that things could have gone in a way that was a lot more corporate. And it didn't. And when we talk about the other questions about some other software projects that wound up being governed in right ways or wrong ways, even in the history of Python, sometimes it was right and sometimes wrong. Next question.
Maybe you've already answered this somewhat. I'm Todd Gamblin from Lawrence Livermore National Lab. So you talked a lot about doing the right thing for the community, but Python's a lot of different communities. Can you talk about where you might have had difficulty, or where the current organization of Python's been particularly effective with dealing with things like the numerical community of Python is kind of separate from the web community. You've got things like Conda out there versus like the PyPI, stuff like that.
Let's give that to Emily, who looks like she's got a great answer percolating in her head.
Yeah, I think that I kind of stay out of this a little bit. I am very much a Python user, but I also became a core developer because I was interested in the language and how the language worked at the compiler level. So I don't think I'm the right person for this one.
Was Paul Dubois at Lawrence Livermore?
Yes.
Yes. All right. And so in the if I remember things correctly, numeric was like Spam 3 at Reston was when a bunch of those people started forming a community that was one of the first communities distinct from the larger Python community.
I don't remember, honestly.
Right. Yeah. Then it's true, right?
Yeah.
And so I think there's been a long history of that, of kind of sub-communities that have a distinct identity and almost governance. There was a time period where we had SIGs in Python. And those went away, right? There really isn't a concept of special interest groups in Python anymore.
Kind of still exist in specialized domains. I think there's an email SIG that hasn't seen. Distutil SIG.
Yeah.
Packaging.
SourceForge forever.
Packaging. CAPI, yeah. So, yeah, those are probably pretty
Would
hot
you
topics.
describe, as two release managers, would you describe release management and release managers and teams and things like that as a distinct community in Python, somewhat like the point being made?
Well, release managers are a rare breed. I'm not sure how they actually get chosen. I was just kind of approached one time, and this is how it happened to me. But when I joined that small community, it turned out that it does have its own culture. And it does have its own kind of needs and tooling and kind of terms they're using, and some open and some closed communication channels, some of which might be just comments on otherwise publicly available things that you're reading, like comments on the website and whatnot.
Do they have authority?
Do they have authority? No, not really.
When they say something, it's taken as...
Well, obviously, there are very important pieces of both infrastructure and kind of how the project is being run that affect whether a release appears on a timely basis and has acceptable quality. So this is actually the domain of a release manager, where kind of probably the biggest hammer that a release manager has is just take your feature away. Just saying hey, what you just committed caused a bunch of problems. You're not either unwilling or unable to fix them on a timely basis, and the calendar just kind of doesn't wait for us. So I have to take this away. But most of the time, we don't have to use this hammer. It's a very brutal hammer. People would get very upset if you take a feature that they worked very hard on for a long time. So obviously, you kind of have this power in theory, but you would do everything in your power to avoid using it, because it's just humans. We just, we should kind of get along. But there's a number of things that we have to kind of do to make sure that everybody who is a Python user, who expects new versions to appear on a timely basis according to our calendar, we ourselves set, right? Like that those kind of needs are met, that they see new releases both in terms of features and in terms of bug fixes that they can depend on. There is a big community that is kind of mostly invisible from the user side, which is redistributors. So people who provide the versions of Python that most of us use, like for example, like Canonical for Ubuntu, or Fedora, Red Hat, and so on and so on. So we have to also kind of make a timely releases and releases that are kind of predictable in how they look like and how they behave, so that all of the other users can get Python on their machines.
You made a point about just because you have some power or authority doesn't mean you have to use it. Made me think a little bit about when the Python packaging project said pipenv is an official, then they didn't even get the word official out before all hell was broken loose. So we are down to just a couple more minutes. We have one more question.
We have 3 more questions. However, you are more than welcome to go to lunch.
Yeah, we will do a breakup, and then we will stay for 10 minutes after. So do you want to do one more question before breaking up or not?
Yeah, let's do one more.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so I have a little bit of a hard question. You guys obviously talk about how you want to expand the leadership team and you want to expand the pipeline and build the next generation of people coming into the language. But at the same time, you're also moving from being all volunteers and everybody volunteering all the time from that to being paid, like some people being paid, and memberships going from being completely free to being paid, and then so I was wondering how you were going to plan on adding kind of a marketing component to how do you communicate your vision for to the masses of people who would think about potentially becoming more active in the community, more involved in leadership positions, and helping to teach people about how to move into those roles that you envision, and how you plan on facilitating that, basically, especially since there's been this kind of evolution of a communication infrastructure alongside the governance thing with the podcasts and the email newsletters and the blogs and the wikis and everything. So how do you plan on leveraging that kind of media infrastructure to also communicate the new visions for engaging the wider community in building the next generation?
That's a good question about the mechanics of it. Do the two of you want to share on this one? Keep it to 30 or 45 seconds so we can wrap up.
I guess the only thing I can really say is that we're trying to figure it out, right? I don't know that we have really any answers. I think, for example, spinning up a discourse instance is an experiment, and it just takes time to sort of see what people gravitate to. There's, there's a lot of these things that in some way we think it's all planned out, but really it isn't. We're trying to figure things out, and a lot of it, again, comes from the community. People will say, this is a really important thing that I care about, and I want to raise the visibility of this, bring it to the PSF, bring it to the steering council. We're all very open to, your participation and your impetus for those things, and then it can kind of get on our radar and we can start to think about it.
Maybe you can give her more detail on her question afterwards. All right, the best 2 words in any talk. In conclusion, one point I'd like to add is, remember, these are actual people who are giving of themselves in order for all of us to succeed. I was talking with Grace about it, that a conference like this, all we have to do is show up and complain. The conference organizers sleep 1 hour over 7 days and make us happy. These 4 people have given a lot. Release management, would you want to do it? Would you want to listen to you? No, you wouldn't. And with what Emily's doing, both on the core team, but now on one conference and then one Colossus, and then Barry over 700 years being everybody's best friend and keeping us all on the rails, please come up to them and say thank you and fill their tank up a little bit during the conference. We'll stick around for 10 more minutes. Thank you for staying to the end.